guests here, dear friends, dear colleagues, at INZ and online. My name is Marko Zajec. I'm the leader of the political history program, and I have a very nice task to do now to introduce our dear colleague and friend, and also, which is for us, for our institution important, our visiting fellow for 14 days, Tamara Scheer from Vienna. And if you allow me, first I will introduce her, and then I will give her the word. Privat docentin Dr. Tamara Scheer specializes in Austro-Hungary, focusing primarily on the non-German speaking dimension of Austrian history from 18th to 20th century, linguistic and religious diversity, and the First World War. Since 2009, she has held a lecturer position at the University of Vienna, specifically within the Institute of Contemporary History and Institute of Eastern European Studies, Eastern European History. Her habilitation was centered on language diversity and loyalty in the Austro-Hungarian Army from 1867 to 1918, and she was afterwards the recipient of 2 3-year grants from the Austrian Science Fund. In 2020, she was granted the Venia Docenti for Modern and Contemporary History. Over the past 15 years, Tamara Scheer has engaged in work at various institutes outside Austria, including a 2-year tenure as a head of the doctoral school at the Andrásy University in Budapest, a Dubrovsky Fellowship at the Masaryk Institute at the Czech Academy in Prague, and positions at the Pontifical Institute of Santa Maria dell'Anima in Rome, where she continues to direct the research project. The lecture is titled Language Diversity in the Austro-Hungarian Army, 1867-1918, and Tamara, the word is yours.
Thank you. I just changed the position. It's okay.
It's okay.
Yeah, to see the PowerPoint slides. Does the micro work? Okay. Thank you so much, Marco, for the introduction, and I'm really happy to present my research topic today here at this wonderful institute. And thank you so much again for hosting me for 2 weeks. I can promise you my desk already looks like I'm working here for a couple of years, so it's already messed up, but will become worse within the next week. I always say if a historian has a too clean desk, it's not a proper historian.
Okay. I like to hear that. People are laughing because they know my desk.
So I'm really happy to present you today, which I call, well, I would say it was my 4th book project, and I'm always attached to my previous project, so I wouldn't call it like it's finally settled, but to present you some thoughts and things I think I've found out in the last couple of years, and which finally make up a book too. And so why do I usually focus or have focused for a long time on the Austro-Hungarian Army? When I was a student in Vienna, it was usually very often like courses or classes were labeled with it's Austrian something. But usually it was called Austrian, but it was like focusing on today's Austrian borders. So usually focusing on German language documents, on German communities or German language communities in Habsburg Austria. So my approach always was, if I call it Austro-Hungarian, there should also be Austria-Hungary in. So the Austrian-Hungarian Army for me makes up a really good example to study tendencies or topics monarchy-wide, because it was operating all over Austria-Hungary, and following 1878 it also included Bosnia-Herzegovina. So now everybody asks me, like, how can you approach this? Do you speak all the languages? No, of course I do not. The good thing is with Austro-Hungarian Army that most of the documents look the same all over former Austria-Hungary and Bosnia-Herzegovina. So you can either go to today's Ukraine, Lviv, And the documents, the forms, how they were approached and how they were explained look as like the same like today in Innsbruck, Meran, or in Sarajevo. So 80% is usually in German language and 20% usually reflect the language of the territory where this command was positioned. So I choose the Austro-Hungarian Army, and this is important because there were more than one armed forces between 1867 and 1918. Beside which was my topic, the so-called joint K&K army. There was the KK Territorial Defense in German Landwehr, which operated only in Austria or Cisleithanian Austria. There was the Honvédség that was operating only from Hungary, but within Hungary there was another one which was called Domobránstvo, and it was operating within Croatia. And as a force, I would mention there was also a so-called K&K. K&K indicates that it was a joint institution, the Navy. So I usually love to use this map because it shows how far-reaching topics and discussions went when you were dealing with the Austro-Hungarian Army. And what I found really interesting is that there were so many commands placed everywhere, and commanders were usually asked to report like once a month or twice a month lengthy to the ministry in Vienna what was going on here, not only from a military point of view, but also what were political discussions, clashes, disputes, etc. And I usually love to use this map, which is on Wikipedia, and it's used very often by scholars. And I usually use this because to say never trust in statistics and never trust in categories used for languages or nationalities. But also do not think of that if something like here in northeast Bohemia, and in Bohemia, when there is so reddish and so bluish, that it means like in this space there were only Czech speakers living, and in the red ones only German speakers. But usually it was made up in a way if some village had like 51% Czechs and 49% German speakers, that it was totally blue, and also vice versa the other way around. But what is important for me that when I approached this topic is like I wanted to treat the Habsburg army and look exactly at how they managed to run an army and to drill and educate soldiers, thousands of them every year, and to take their languages into account, or not. So we have to go through this slide because it marks some very important issues to get to know beforehand, to understand my analytical work afterwards. So the Article 19 of the Austrian Constitution from 1867 allowed Austrian citizens to use their language before courts, to be used in schools, and also when they approached any administrative office. But this does not mean that it was properly carried out, and there was lots of mistreatment going on from all the sides involved. But the Austro-Hungarian Army took up this principle and said, when there is a common conscription, 3 years and later for 2 years, we have to take into account and make sure that the soldiers are trained in their native language. However, not everything was translated or carried out in the languages of the soldiers, but there was a joint language of command, which was about 80 terms that every soldier, regardless of his native language, had to commemorate. I mean, with this like look right, look left, and all these military command words. It was about 80. And then there was also like the internal language for correspondence and administration, which was also German, which means like if some commander in, that's called Brody, one of the most eastern garrisons and military spots in Austria-Hungary, they wrote in German to the ministry, they wrote in German to the corps command. So German had to be used for this internal administrative communication, which makes life of an historian much easier because so usually all these reports are written in German. But beside this, there were 11 to 12 recognized, called regimental or soldiers' languages, which referred to the languages which were allowed to be used or had to be used when they were trained. Why do I say 11 to 12? It's because for a while, Serbian and Croatian made up 2 languages, and afterwards it was called Serbo-Croatian. So this is then only 11. There was also many limitations to this language right. Some of these limitations were taken over from provincial administration or provincial constitutions. So the soldiers were only allowed or the language for training was only allowed to be used if it made up a recognized language, and minimum of 20% in a regiment had to, so a language group had to reach minimum 20% within the regiment to be recognized officially, which means like sometimes 19% were not allowed to use their language, and this was still under direct regulation. In summer 1914, 142 regiments and battalions used only one language, 31 among them German. So as you can see, there is plenty of others using another language than German exclusively. 162 were bilingual, and a couple of used 3 or 4. What is interesting is that these 3 or 4 language regiments and battalions usually came from the Kingdom of Hungary. Why? Because in the Kingdom of Hungary, there was no such limitation like with the 20%, as I claimed beforehand. So what was the challenge finally for the Austro-Hungarian Army authorities? You always had to find and employ a sufficient number of training officers and non-commissioned officers who were exactly assigned to that place where the language skills were needed, and to take care that all language requirements are implemented properly, so to avoid that any manipulation takes place on behalf of on a lower level. I will come up with that later on with some examples. So German was the language of command, and as you can see, I'm really an archive mole, so also my stay in Ljubljana will be dedicated to lots of archives. Just to show you how this looked like, so there were these training manuals with the command words, and usually it was about 80, but of course they differed from the branch of the military. So artillery used a couple of words which were differently than the artillery or the infantry. Interestingly, although there was so much claim on that to have that in German and to remain everything in German, there were lots of words who came actually from French language, like exercieren, parieren, or the ménage for food supply, which was somehow traditional because of the very important influence of French military up to the 18th century. Interestingly, although there was still this claim by very many German nationalists among the officers' corps, very often very high authorities and generals, they still remained to these words. Finally, even after the start of the First World War, although a lot of French terms became to be seen as it's now our enemy, we shouldn't use them, but I mean, you cannot change command words within a couple of months. So how did the army find out about the languages the conscripts spoke? And what I really like is I always call them, I always claim that historians can be really happy if there is some kind of serial sources. So a kind of source which starts at the beginning of your period of investigation and is carried out until the very end and looks the same everywhere. And so it's these Grundbuchblätter or conscripts, personnel lists, and they are usually, so they're available for almost all parts of former Austro-Hungary, although there is a big lack for Hungary. So for Hungary, they are only rarely to be found in the archives. But you can see here on the top, like in the Vojenský historický archiv, you have most of them from conscripts from Bohemia, Moravia, Silesia, but also from today's Slovakia. So, as I said, there is almost nothing for Hungary. It's not true because the Slovaks, today's Slovakia, had been part of Hungary. So there is some from Hungary also available. And also in Hrvatski državni archiv, you can find them under the name matični list, and you can find some, at least some of them in Bosnia too, and in the Tiroler Landesarchiv in Tyrol you can also find them. So a great deal of them are still available in archives, so that you can really go through them and then see what's going on. So, but here they distinguish usually between spricht and schreibt. So the soldier was asked for which languages do you speak and which languages do you write. Here on the top it makes up one box, but usually it's two boxes, as you can see below. So they were not asked for their native language or mother tongue or first language or whatsoever. They were asked for which language they spoke. And also there were every year longer and longer, more elaborated rules for the local military, how to fill out these forms, because there was so much mismanagement going on. So usually if they should not mention the first language as first, but there was a catalog of you have to start with German, Hungarian, Czech, and so on. But as you can see here on these examples, it very often happened that some underlinings were made just to count on what's the presumptive native language. And also lots of categories for languages were used which were not allowed to be used, like here, Slavonic on the left and Bosnian on the right. So there were lots of different kinds of terms used additionally. Also Latin here, which goes for today's Tyrol, or also Windisch were quite often used in these kind of sources. So they were asked for their language skills, but what is really important is annually there was a military statistical yearbook, and there they were usually portrayed to belong to nationalities. And if you have seen here that there were underlinings, it's usually that the local military branches were asked for report about the native languages, although they weren't asked for that beforehand. The soldiers, they had to report that annually to the ministry. Finally, they made up nationalities. And what was an additional challenge was to provide enough training personnel as the many idioms and dialects. So even if an officer with a Hungarian native tongue spoke German, standard German fluently, this does not mean that he was able to speak with the Tyrolean from the Alpine region and vice versa. Believe me, when I was working as being from Vienna and Tyrol, that was really hard sometimes, even in the archives, to understand them. And also what I was working with, so not only with forms and with handbooks, I was also working a lot with autobiographical sources. So here is one from a staff officer, August von Urbanski, who wrote about his Hungarian, Transylvanian regiment. Germans, Hungarians, Romanians, Gypsies, and Jews. The Transylvanian Saxons' idiom was difficult to understand, and the Jews spoke Yiddish. So you have, that was really important, and this was really hard. So even when on paper they spoke German and the other one spoke too, this does not necessarily mean that they were able to communicate properly. So what about the officers? There were the conditions for the officers that as soon as they were deployed at the new regiment. So usually every 3rd or 4th year, Austro-Hungarian officers had to change garrison. They were asked within 3 years to learn the new language properly. So firsthand, even if they learned it or not, it means that lots of conscripts were faced with an officer within his 3 years deadline who were barely able to talk to them. And here is the Qualifikationslisten, is another kind of source I used quite often. These Qualifikationslisten are the personnel files of the Austro-Hungarian officers. And also here you see that they were not asked for the first language, but they were asked for which languages they spoke and to what degree is also added. And for what is really interesting is that also in autobiographical sources of those who are affiliating with some German nationalism, they often wrote that the Austro-Hungarian officers' corps was overwhelmingly dominated by German by officers of German nationality. And also the statistics usually indicated that. Because why? When they counted the first language, they usually counted even when there was a bilingual. And I brought this example here who spoke Hungarian and Němečky perfectly, of whom I know Croatian was his first language, but usually they then counted him as a German. And already, so the first one who critically took these numbers into account was already István Deák. But what he did is, like, of course, the German group was now much less, but there were so many of, he called mixed nationality. It's the ones he was not able to say what the first language was. Why? Because so many of the officers already started their military somehow career because they were sent to military boarding schools when they were at young age, and they usually used German there as teaching language. So very often also in their autobiographical sources, the officers said, like, I'm much better in German than in my native tongue because I've spent in this German-speaking environment most of my lifetime. So what is really difficult is to assign to a lot of these officers a nationality when it comes, if you look at their language knowledge. And my favorite example is this of Raimund Gerber or Gruber. Why? Because thanks to, as Marco said, 2-3 years project grants, I was able to see really for over 10 years so many sources. And sometimes it's really great if you read that some other officer is writing about another officer and attached to him a nationality. And so was the case for Raimund Gerber. So according to his personnel file, he was born in Ogulin, was Greek Oriental, which is usually the term used by Austro-Hungarian administration for Serbian Orthodox. He was already the son of an army officer, and he spoke, when he joined the army, German and Croatian perfectly, Slovenian and Czech sufficiently. And now you have this, one of his peers, Eduard Sanantoni, who remembered Gerber was a Serb. His father, a low-ranking officer in the old military frontiers, or graničari. And Ginsky wrote, when I served as a lieutenant, my colonel was Raimund Gerber. He was a genuine Croat. So it's what I always call, it's like, it's really hard to attach a nationality to lots of these Austro-Hungarian soldiers. So I already said, like, that they had to learn the language within 3 years, and there was, so Austro-Hungarian bureaucracy always had really fine terminology for all what was required. So this is zum Dienstgebrauch genügend, which is sufficient for service, and they had to learn this. So these 3 years very often expired, and I went through, I don't know, 1,000 of these personnel files of officers. So it happened really often that the date expired and they didn't learn the language. What did happen? So some had a good contact, which means they were just transferred to another regiment where they either spoke the language or they did not, and so the 3 years started again. And there were others whose contact or who did not have a good network within the officers' corps, who then really left the army service. What they helped each other with is that there was really lots of published so-called military language handbooks where they were somehow to grab this zum Dienstgebrauch genügend, sufficient for service. What is really interesting is that it was so much over-bureaucratized, organized, that what they had to know and what not, but finally there were no standard language tests with which they proved that they really spoke the language or not. But these military language handbooks are somehow indicative for what some of them passed the test just by repeating these standard sentences from garrison, daily life and training. So who really did the job? If it was not the officers, because they were unable to, or lots of them were unable to properly communicate with the soldiers, it was the non-commissioned officers. So while most of the officers did not come from the region, because they were placed all over Austria-Hungary in regiments, the non-commissioned officers usually came from the region, and there was no professional NCO corps back then, but usually every year, it was the so-called the more clever ones among the new conscript cohort should be asked to be sent not to the normal soldier school, but to NCO schools. So, and usually the ones, and statistics indicate that usually the ones who spoke the necessary languages were asked to become NCO. Or those, and this is an example from Karansebes, Romania or Hungary back then, the ones who spoke the language which was desperately needed because the Romanian language knowledge was not widespread among Austro-Hungarian officers. There was a huge political debate about this language system of the Austro-Hungarian Army in peacetime, although there were two totally separate discussions, political discussions in Austria and in Hungary. And I've brought you just this example, and thanks to Alex, the stenographical protocols of the houses, so of the Austrian parliament, let's say like lower house of the Austrian parliament, are already digitized, although I saw on the way onto my office, you have them here in paper, in print, thank you. I felt at home. And there you can now really approach them also full text access, which is interesting because there was barely one meeting where there were no discussions about the mismanagement of these language rights of the soldiers. And I've brought you one example which was somehow not the common critique. It was Ignacy Šitnik from the Slovene club. And he said, I know from my own experience, I was a soldier myself, that knowledge of the regimental language is necessary for the officer, like fins are for a fish. He cannot help himself, otherwise he's dumb. So it's not a purely chauvinistic question, but a practical one. So why does he point on chauvinistic? So I went through these parliamentary protocols, and usually, even when the army, so I compared it with the internal war ministerial discussion. So even when the army and its minister was convinced that the critique was totally true, it was usually like that the Czech delegate came up with, they don't speak Czech. And then they turned it immediately after into national cause. And then came the Slovene one, and then came the Italian from Tyrol. So it was always the same. So it was relatively easy that the minister who were asked to respond to this critique just said, oh, that's all nationalistic. We do not have to take that into account at all. And I'm pretty sure that Šitnik also referred to his to the other delegates, like saying, and to all this discourse, like, look, there is a practical question that there is soldiers who are not able to communicate for 3 years. So it was a critique going to the ministry and to, but that was rare voices. What was the peacetime political debate in Hungary? So while in Austro-Hungary was this Article 19, which more or less said that all these 8 languages are equal people's languages, although of course they were not equally treated in the bureaucracy. But in Hungary there was nothing like that. Hungary had a state language, which was Hungarian, and there was no official regulations like that the others have to be taken into account. But Austro-Hungarian garrisons with these language rights for soldiers were spread also over Hungary, and they adopted the language right of the Austrian constitution. So there was a really huge debate in Hungary, and one of the important sentences is like, Magyar nyelv állam nyelves nem ezred nyelv, which means Hungarian is a state language and not only a regiment language, because there was this constant critique that it was German-dominated, these Austro-Hungarian garrisons, and Hungarian was only treated like Serbian language and German language within the Kingdom of Hungary. So there was a constant discussion. Interestingly, the system, how it was adopted in 1867, almost never changed until the outbreak of, so the language system of the Austro-Hungarian Army almost never changed until the outbreak of the First World War. So from an Austrian point of view in the parliament, because they just claimed for everybody's talks, it's nationalistic. And there was only one exception for Hungary, when Hungarian became compulsory to be used in training with conscripts when they know Hungarian as second language. What did happen? Usually Austro-Hungarian officers who set up these personnel files of the conscripts just dropped if someone spoke Hungarian. So they just mentioned the first language that, well, this man doesn't speak Hungarian, so he does not have to be, we do not have to train him in Hungarian. So, as I said, in the parliament there was rarely one meeting where the language question of the army was not debated. Also, the press regularly was dealing with that, and it was something like between sarcasm and uncovering existing deficiencies. Just one example is with Simplicissimus, which also usually the press came up with when it's ironic or sarcastic, like that the officers didn't speak the language. And here is these two guys who look like they had served in the army, but it's quite a while ago. And the one said, no, Wenzel usually used in German language when they refer to a Czech. No, Wenzel, wie wird jetzt kommandiert bei euch? Deutsch oder Böhmisch? Kommandiert wird Deutsch, damit wir es lernen, aber geschimpft wird Böhmisch, damit wir es verstehen. So, which means, no, Wenzel, how are you commanded? In German or in Bohemian, which usually refers to Czech? No, we are commanded in German, so that we learn it. But we curse in Bohemian so that we understand it. So this referred to one of the most important critiques, that officers learned the soldiers' language only to a degree that they can insult them. And also jokes like from Die Muskete, where a colonel, referring to that a colonel who does not speak the regiment language has to give a speech in front of all the soldiers. And the one-year volunteer, so really below his rank, was laughing, and the colonel addressed him like, hey, you don't laugh about your own stupidity. So this refers to another thing which can be found very often in autobiographical sources. It's like that the officers experienced this, that they had to approach a class of usually like 90% peasants who are so belong not only their military rank, but their social rank. And they had to give in their language instructions, and they laughed about that. So a lot of them wrote in a way like, I totally lost confidence, and some really developed something like from very early on, oh, I hate the Slovenians or the Italians because my first job was to train them, and I hated that because I didn't speak the language. So it also somehow you can see in the diaries and in the letters that they developed something like a hatred towards certain nationalities. What also happened, and this was usually interestingly heavily criticized in nationalist press and also in the parliaments, was like mixing up languages. I mentioned only two here, which come up in the sources most often. It's Armee Slavic, Army Slavic, and Barrack Polish. And interestingly, this is something like, I always tell my students, so if you only look on one kind of source, you might come to that conclusion. But if you look at another source, you come to a totally different one. And if you just read newspapers on these mixed languages and how they portray that, it's usually like, it's an offense to the pureness of our highest national good, the language. If these soldiers who were spending 3 years in the army now come out like not speaking Hungarian anymore properly, but mixing that up with German or Czech or whatever. And also when you read the parliamentary debates, and this goes the same for Austria and Hungary, like they are not proper Hungarians, Czechs, and so on anymore. So that's the one side, if you only use these sources. If you read autobiographical sources, which is really hard very often that you find a real ordinary soldier's autobiographical source, but I had 10 years, so lucky me, I found at least enough to see a tendency. Oh, they never complained about that. Rather the other way around. So many of them were just coming home to the village, like, look, now I speak German, so they used some German words or Hungarian or whatever. And it also was something I very often found in these autobiographical sources. It was something when wherever they came from and wherever, to whatever nationality they belonged to, when two former soldiers, conscripts, met each other somewhere, they used this language as a kind of joint identity, so this army identity. And for me, this was really interesting to read that regardless of all these wearing the emperor's coat propaganda, this mixing of languages or using in your own language these command words they had to learn much more contributed to this we feeling than any propaganda did. And so this is just one famous song which was very often sung everywhere. It's like the Kanonier Jaburek, which mixes up Czech and German totally. It was really hard to attach here the English translation. What is also important, and I was really surprised how many kind of different military sources there are approachable when it comes to language use. One is these, I mean, I know before I started the project that there is these huge monumental regimental histories, which are usually like broidened and really big books. And they were all in German, except for some Hungarian regiments that were in Hungarian. But there was really an approach, someone came up in the ministry with that, that we need a regimental history, which is not super expensive and only in German, but with which the soldiers can more easily, buy them and use them and read them and more identify with them. And there came this regulation, like there should be regimental histories for the rank of files. And it's really interesting to see, because they sent out this order all over Austro-Hungary, and it's really interesting to see how different the regiments approached this order. So there is some who just translated the big book into a more simpler language, again in German. And then there is some who really did it in both languages, like here, in German and in Czech. So this is the famous 28th Regiment, which became known during the First World War because it was abandoned. And there were some, and for me, okay, it had nothing to do with my language question, but I found it so nicely done, because usually you have this, yes, our regiment won this battle in the 18th century, and Colonel this and Lieutenant that did this job, and some approached it in a way like it's not the officers who are the heroes, but it's the ordinary soldiers who are highlighted, which I found really nicely done. Okay, it's nothing to do with the language. What is really important is that this language diversity, mixing up languages, soldiers doing their military service, not in their home region, but somewhere else, because it was not only the officers who were migrating to another garrison, it was also always one part of a regiment had to serve in a totally different part of the monarchy. So this army language diversity became a totally daily life phenomenon, which can also be found very often on postcards. So there is one, it's navy, but it was, you were able to buy it, of course, in the streets, everywhere, so also the army members used it. And it's this guy like approaching the cat in 4 languages, halt da, who is here, stop. So it's something like that. So postcards were very often using more than one language. Why? I mean, the big question is it because they want to highlight the positiveness of a multilingual empire, or is it just like more people can buy it if you use already all the languages on one postcard? So you earn more money and it's cheaper to produce, of course, too. And the other one is from Bosnia. It's Sretan Bosic, also in 4 languages. So you can find, if you grab a lot, and over many years, you can find lots of these daily life army-related stuff. So, and then there was, I'm already 12 and it's fine. So we have a war to go and then we're done. Then what was the mobilization in summer 1914? I mean, what I said is like there were really deficiencies and lots of conscripts were not allowed to use their languages. Was it either out of laziness, because there were always enough training personnel available who spoke German. So very often the ones who were reported as to speaking Czech and German were trained in German and not in Czech. So very often laziness, also very often nationalism in a way of we want to keep the Slovene speakers or the Czech speakers lower than 20% to be a German regiment. This also happened, of course. But all these discussion, it was not threatening the lives of the soldiers or the ones engaged. This happened then during mobilization and in the war. And very interestingly, lots of also famous novelists pointed on this multi-language diversity of the army, like Stefan Zweig in World of Yesterday. The Babelish language confused and caused an additional hardship for soldiers of every imaginable nationality who had been thrown into this rolling coffin. I mean, in the beginning, it was not so much due to language diversity a big problem, because usually those who recently were trained in this multilingual environment met and were sent firsthand to the front. But the longer the war went on and the more losses there were just newly recruited who never looked back on properly learning command languages and so on. What is for me really interesting is that there were lots of, this was what I was doing in the morning in the city archive here. It's like how many escaped enlistment before the war because they worked already somewhere else. So there were very many. So I would say today from Ljubljana was like, there's always 8 on one page, a minimum 2. Before 1913, were no longer living in Austria-Hungary or in Ljubljana. So lots of these soldiers who had now to be recruited lived abroad, some of them for many years. Some were even born there. And so they also had to announce that they are now called up for fighting for Austria-Hungary. And for me, this is, but you can find these in 6 languages that they should show up at the consulate or at the embassy to be called to arms, or first to find out if they are fit for service. That's the Luxembourg one, but you can find it also from newspapers in New Zealand, South America. So that was, and usually, interestingly, is that usually on the same page, the German Empire announced that it was only in German, and then there will come always this whole page and all the translation for Austria-Hungary. So the first weeks, and there is lots of soldiers, officers referring to these first weeks of fighting and the language and which impact the language diversity had. So, for example, Robert Michel, the first days in Vienna were full of work. In the morning, I addressed my men briefly in the mother tongue. And as soon as I ended my speech, all of them rushed, surrounded me, and lifted me onto their shoulders. So there is the ones who met already with those they recently trained and who spoke the language of the soldiers, and they usually portrayed it in a way that it was much easier to propagate a fighting spirit among them when you spoke the language. And another one, Anton Lehas, wrote, in Pressburg, many residents, as well as most of the soldiers from Wieselburg County, spoke solely German. Members of the civil service, many craftsmen and people from the surrounding villages spoke solely Hungarian. Most of the soldiers were Slovaks. Thus, communication among the officers, the NCOs, and the rank and file was difficult. I was partly fine because I spoke Hungarian and also had some Slavic knowledge from my time in Prague. In my battalion, 1/3 of the officers spoke solely German, the rest Hungarian. Only a few were able to communicate in Slovak. As you can see, it was the first days where they already thought like, okay, this question of, yeah, let's mix, or you can always find someone to translate. Already in the first week was like, oof. So this is how all this language system was now going to work in practice. But the thing is that this marks a really change in the approach of the contemporaries to language diversity. It's like in the first couple of weeks, they were just saying in a way like, yeah, there were Slovaks and there were Germans and they spoke this and that language, but it was not attached to some kind of, we do not trust them when they're speaking this language. What is really important is, I mean, there were big maneuvers before the First World War, but in the first weeks, many of them wrote down like it can't be compared to any maneuver, which was just playing war, and it's not war. And what then happened is, what I was really surprised is that when I first started to work on that, I thought, who is the easiest scapegoat to be blamed when you're losing a battle or something fails at the front? It would be language diversity, obviously, I said. But interestingly, it was usually not blamed. So other things were blamed, like the Czechs betrayed us, or the Slovenes were not, the Slovenes were not reliable, or whatever. But it was not the language diversity as a practical issue. Although if you go through the autobiographical sources, you find lots of moments where understanding was not possible and there were much higher casualties. Like this one from Oscar Konstantin Schneider, who was a staff officer who had a horse and went through the part of the front line to check where the enemy is. At the last moment, we recognized in the horsemen our hussars. Only pity that one could not speak with them. We did not understand the language well enough. How many valuable messages were lost that way. And for the first time, I became aware of the multilingualism of the monarchy with all its disadvantages. It was never properly expressed during the great peacetime maneuvers. Now these fateful silent meetings became more and more frequent, as if members of mutually hostile armies were meeting. What is also interesting is that very often, if you go for the autobiographical sources, it's not like that someone says, I'm losing fighting morale or my identity with for whom I'm fighting or whatever, because I can't speak with the NCO officer. It was more like the feeling lonely moment. And it's really interesting how many came up with that. And even Egon Erwin Kisch recalled that it rained and became darker and darker. Comrades lost one another. I ended up in a column of Magyar Honvéds, whose language I did not speak, and feel even more lonely than ever before. And this moment of feeling lonely, although you are squeezed like a sardine into these trenches, but you are not able to speak with someone, tell them your biggest fears and what all the others who were able to talk to one another portrayed in a way like camaraderie and all of this. For them, it was like, I'm here alone and I can't talk to anyone. And the longer the war lasted, the more it was unable to put a group according to languages to some part of the front line. So more and more it mixed up. And he is also like Eugen Weber, Juricic, who was a Croat, was unable to speak 5 words in German. He's unable to communicate with anyone. In his spare time, he sits around and stares. The other soldiers explain by hands what he has to do, like to a Negro from Central Congo. So this is really something where you really feel also through letters, when you find letters which takes up this, that this was really a moment where morale was going down totally. What is also very important is that this misunderstanding was not only among soldiers, but it was also with the local population. And of course, there was this run after possible Russian spies, where really thousands of Ruthenian Galicians were hanged or sentenced by death because they accused them of being Russophiles. But very often it was also had something to do that that officers and soldiers were not able to talk to the local population, although they all had the Austrian citizenship, which they always in their autobiographical sources, it came as a surprise, they often wrote. We didn't know how big our country is finally. And here you have something like, in conversation with the farmer, I came upon the surprising fact that he spoke fluent English. He had, after all, worked for years in Canada. We're back to the Ljubljana City Archive, because many of these who left afterwards returned home. And also very often it was the priests for whom it was, they had to do the pastoral care in all the languages, even if they did not understand it. And he said, and I think this is a really interesting quotation, because it's somehow an excuse for this mass violence directed to the population, but it also bears something like a criticism on that might be languages learned in peacetime to the officers, but there was never properly learned all these different cultures and religions. And he wrote, if at least the officers had known the religious and ethnological conditions of their own country, he means Galicia and Bukovina, it would not have been possible to suspect every Greek Catholic church to be Russian and to consider every Ruthenian priest in such a church, most of whom legally married, to be a Russian priest. So this is also something. It's connected to language knowledge, but it's also some additional things. So I will 5 more minutes and then I'm done. yeah. What's also important is censorship. So losing morale was also connected to, because they were totally overwhelmed with the masses of letters going from the front every day to the home and back. Of course, there were regulations how to censor them, but interestingly, these regulations with no word refer to, okay, but they are in all the languages, so who should do the censorship? What then happened is that sometimes letters needed months to arrive, or which also happened is that at some point, let it be a post office somewhere in the rear of a front line, they just throw away these language, the letters in that language. They had no one who could do censorship. I mean, imagine that one of the most important messages for the families at home, I'm still alive, do not arrive. Why they then invented this free-to-use postcard, which became known as Ich bin gesund, es geht mir gut Karte, so with the most important, which was not censored, but you were also not allowed to write anything else on there than the address. What's also important is like pastoral care. So also there was many publications in small size to ensure that the soldiers are supported by someone who knows the language, not necessarily the same religion, because the pastoral care regulations from pre-1914 said every military clergyman, whatever kind of Jewish, Orthodox, they should, if there is no other priest of the same religion available, they should support the soldier. But what then came up is a lot of publications like this little booklet for field rabbis in Hungarian, Hebrew, and German. Or how to confess in all the languages. They made up this little polyglottus. So I not lost my thread. That's bad. But it happened at page 28. That's good. So a lot of so also for the Roman Catholics, they somehow try to how to overcome this. That we don't have a priest, the Roman Catholic priest everywhere and can talk to the soldiers, but they have to confess, especially when they're dying. And back then, before when the First World War started, it was not allowed to use an interpreter for this moment. This changed during the First World War by a papal decree or order. Treating the wounded was the same, like there was not always like the military doctor of your own army spoke your language, nor the nurse did. And also the autobiographical sources, novels, and lots of reports tell this, that people die and they were not able to talk to anyone while they are waiting for medical treatment. I really like this because it's also mixing up the languages. It's from Miroslav Krleža, which is really important. Hrvatski Bog Mars. Dear brothers, I beg you to be quiet. It hurts, as should we. So also he in the novel uses the different kind of languages. It always gets a bit lost in translation when you're doing the talk in English, but he's mixing it up. The prisoners of war is another chapter, like then they are ended up in a prisoner of war camp, is it in Russia or in Italy or wherever, and that they are mixed and they are often also not able to talk to one another, although the bigger it grows, the better it is. And also commemoration. So the language diversity did not stop with the First World War, but also how these soldiers were commemorated in the years after the First World War. And there is some of these, I mean, the one from Križ Santa Croce was, which is next to Trieste, was built a couple of years ago, but it refers to the different languages of the house regiment and the people living there. But what is really important is this really big First World War war cemeteries. And on the right, I don't know why it's not working, the slide doesn't work properly. But this is from Godlice Tanov. So there is about, 15 really big war cemeteries, which were located right behind the front. And what I always criticize is if you go through that, and of course, they somehow look like they looked during the war. But I really don't understand when no one has done some kind of project that they are using the languages of these soldiers. So if someone approaches this cemetery today, and you usually have an explanation in German and then the local language, and then you go through, and usually the names and everything is just in German. Of course, they are not of German nationality. Petra, we were there, so it's like if someone has no clue, thinks like, okay, all the Austro-Hungarian soldiers were Germans. So we have done a little project which recently came out, and I'm really happy that also two of my project team members are here, Petra and Rog. So what we tried here is there is a crypt under a church in Rome, Santa Maria dell'Anima, and there's 460 Austro-Hungarian soldiers there. And what we really want to avoid is that something coming out like this, just because it's the German language church, that everything then be shown is in German. And so we did the booklet now, the first publication in English, but we tried to use all the other languages, two of these soldiers in there, to let them speak. And yeah, so commemoration. So it's still going on, how to reflect the language diversity of the Austro-Hungarian Army. Yeah. Oh, this is a little self-advertisement. I know it's a bit too much of QR codes, but if you want to see, so the book about the language diversity, which came out, is in German, but I did the habilitation thesis in English, and it's full text available online. And also a little article via Botstieber, and then Rock and my own ethnic boxes, where I try to squeeze in as much as of army as possible. So thank you very much for coming, and I'm speaking already too long, so...
Thank you very much, and you ended with boxes. It was so interesting, and almost an hour has passed almost without knowing it. And it's rightfully so, because we're here at Zgodovina na špici, History in the Edge, we let people speak. Because usually at the conferences, they just bound to 15-20 minutes. And it was so nice, but do not be afraid. We still have time for questions and answers. And since we have a huge audience, a lot of historians and others who will maybe ask a question or give a comment, since they have also already worked together. And please do. And people online also. You can write in the chat box, and we will somehow ask. Anyone?
Yeah. No historian, no common paper. Thank you so much. My name is Tamara Scheer, we don't know each other, and this is fascinating for me. And of course, I look through this through the eyes of my own research, which concerns another army, another multi-ethnic army with a rather different approach to language politics, and that's the Yugoslav army during the socialist Yugoslavia. And I did a lot also about language. I'm a linguist myself. And it was interesting to see this opposition at some point between how important language issue became at some point, especially here in Slovenia in the 80s, language use within the Yugoslav army. And on the other hand, also as in your case, the fact that the soldiers themselves, usually even Slovenian soldiers who served in the army in the 80s, did not have any problem with it. They didn't see a political or any other problem in the fact that they couldn't really use their own mother tongue. And on the other hand, the fact that also this usual sentence, this claim that only one language was used in the Yugoslav army was not really true entirely. That army was aware of trying to be the really pillar of Yugoslavism on one hand and using one language on the other. So they tried to do a lot. There were many discussions exactly that the officers need to learn other languages. There were army newspapers which were bound to these, how do you call it, these military areas and each military areas would use also the language of the majority there. So I think it was Naša vojska, the newspaper written, published here in the 5th military area, which comprised Slovenia and Croatia. And basically 50-50 was the ratio between the articles in Serbo-Croatian and in Slovenian. So there were many, but not only that, but especially in the early period, Yugoslav army was also a place for making people literate, a place for cultural activities. So my question actually goes to that direction. Were there debates, or did KMK army saw itself also as a polygon for like citizenship, education of the citizens, and how it related to this rather kind of, I wouldn't say unique, because you showed us it was not that needed, there were many intersections, but kind of, you know, ethnically, let's say, conditionally based regiments.
I thank you for the question. I just want to show something, because I could have told another half an hour about that. What they did is like, so when they did the 3-year service, it was usually like they were like exercising outside, of course, but they were also the so-called Mannschaftsschule, which means they were sitting in a classroom, and in this classroom they used this for the history of the regiment, so that they more affiliate with their regiment. But part of this course was also that, I hope I get it in English how they say it, so there was the regulation, the handbook saying that, and the officers should teach the conscripts the role their nationality played within the overall empire. So like, from a practical point of view, oh, you Slovenes did something good here and there, and this is why. So they used it also to shape their political notions. But part of that was also that those who are not able to write, that they get more alphabetized, but which is bad if the officer doesn't speak the language. What is really interesting is that some came up in their autobiographical sources, ordinary soldiers, like complaining. I mean, if I have to waste these 3 years in the army, it would have been much better to learn another language and not to being attached again with my own fellows. But this was really like, no way. You are this. So they were also obliged to serve within their nationality.
Maybe I will here go into, thank you very much, into the, and mix another period, another topic, since it attaches slightly to what Tanya said. And the criticism at that time, especially in the 80s in Slovenia, was of course usually, and they use this idea that regiments, they can speak also other languages, and certain regiments, of course. It was a critique by young opposition at the time, even left opposition didn't write, especially Janez Janša, said, okay, let's take this as an example. Let's take this as an example of what Austro-Hungary did. So it was even better for Slovenians. The Slovenian language was more acknowledged in Austro-Hungary than is in Yugoslavia. It was a critique to the Yugoslav army. So those debates are connected, and also those people who were studying this linguistic and also in general the army situation, they knew about their history. They were studying history, and they used it also for political purposes. And any other question, maybe?
May I just add to what you said? It's really interesting for me when I see much later political debates, but when a group of people then referred in a positive way on a system, they would have never did it that way before 1918. So it was really used for so many explanations everywhere, all over Central Europe. Why I'm always surprised who is using that then as a positive example.
Yeah. No.
Anyone?
Then I can. No, I think this is really a very important debate about to which extent solely ethnic box, ethnic framework gives, or nationalism as such, gives the only framework for emancipation. And for instance, for me, in these debates about the Yugoslav army, who was the partisan, the army officers, and then he got retired, he became harsh critic of Yugoslav army because of language hegemony there. And he was saying that it's not good for young Slovenians, especially those from deprivileged backgrounds, because they are deprivileged there. But my own ethnographic research says quite the opposite, that exactly because it was not boxed in this way, people could transcend also their class positions in this very liminal year of the army service.
Yeah, this is what I would also claim after 10 years researching this system. It allows a lot of flexibility. This flexibility was in some cases used to nationalize everything and to oppress and marginalize others, but it was also used to something like, oh, I can claim whatever identity or whatever native tongue, whatever. The flexibility is there, but it's local actors who then can transform it this or that way.
Thanks. Rok, you have a comment?
We know each other for quite some time, and I've worked on these topics as well, and worked on them jointly on a few occasions. But this is a question that actually just dawned on me now. I remember that Archduke Rudolf, the heir to the throne, before he shot himself, in one of his pamphlets or letters said that actually it would be a good idea to have a neutral language for the empire. But because it does not exist, we have to use German, which is of course most widespread. However, the question is, was there ever did they ever seriously entertain the idea of using a neutral language for the army as the language of command or internal administration, but mostly as the language of command? Was there ever anybody seriously suggesting, okay, let's use Latin, for example, or let's use English or
Esperanto.
Because this is something that I never came across. And it really was not a question that I ever asked myself, but you worked on these sources a lot, so you might have.
I think I never came across in this army higher authorities debate, because for them, German had this status, like being more or less neutral, because they really wanted to have, and it started with Francis Joseph, they wanted to have to use it in a way as a lingua franca, like Latin, and not to be attached to a particular nationality or to make the army to seem German. But then there were, and I read so many nasty pamphlets from German nationalists all over Austro-Hungary who always claimed like it's a German army and our emperor is a German and can't be only. And so they transformed this neutral German language into a national label. But this was not intended by the highest ranking military authorities, although there were also very often German nationalists among them. But finally, somehow, it was from the top Francis Joseph who somehow told them, if you are too nationalistic in whatever kind of, you won't have a career in that army. And so they were usually, I found a lot of cases where really German nationalist officers lost their rank because of that. Because of pamphlets like that, claiming that it's a German army and the German character has to be preserved for our German emperor.
Very interesting, although I think even if this was from a point of Slovenian or even earlier Slovenian nationalists, they would also oppose this idea that the German should be lingua franca, maybe up to a certain point. This is also, and it's obviously that there were different interpretation and different perception of what kind of language. And even being lingua franca does not mean that the languages would be equal, of course. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but there is another moment that the language of command is language, foreign to everyone more or less equally. Like, also like Serbs or Croats or Bosnians when they go to the Yugoslav army, they also had to learn that it was not the part of everyday communication practices. It's simply a performative language, which can be actually in any idiom, more or less. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This performative, I have to remember. I'm really happy that you're a linguist, because you approach it totally differently. And you're right. I mean, that's a vocabulary no one would use usually in his private life.
Everyone was more or less starting from the scratches in, accommodating these protocols. Yeah. Although, of course, it was for one part of people, it was their mother tongue, but still, it's not the language they use daily.
I mean, actually, German was rarely their mother tongue. It was usually Tyrolean or English or something like that. So actually, in parliamentary debates, you can find this point being made. Actually, the German parliamentarians say, or German-speaking parliamentarians say, that German-speaking soldiers have to learn this language as well. It's falling to them as well. It's just because of the French that you mentioned, but also because it's called Deutsch. It's not a language that they use at home regularly. So
although when they came home, like our fathers, when they came, they used this on them to wake up children. Vojsko.
Yeah.
so it's like it entered the everyday life.
You're referring to the song, right? I know it.
Of course. Once learned.
I learned it in Otterkring at home in the park when we were 12, and then we were singing that on the streets in Vienna.
Okay.
Yeah.
That nice experience in multilingualism.
But we didn't understand the content.
Great. Thank you for sharing this experience of living on the streets of Vienna and Otterkring, of course. Specifically. Any other question?
No, I just have to thank you, Tamara, for this lecture. I just wanted, you mentioned censorship, and I just wanted to mention that censorship reflects this language diversity, as you call it, perfectly well. They were structured according to language groups and plus other languages that they have to censor. So censorship was really meticulous in doing its job during the war. I'm talking about the war period. So it really reflects well all the languages that had to be censored, the languages of the enemies that had to be censored, and so on. So this is just a comment.
I think what is also important, but please correct me, is that no one expected this task in that size before the war. And this is why all these structures they set up, it became more and more and more over the war.
Yes, you're right. And that is why they decided not to censor all the, let's say, all the correspondence, but just the ones from the, let's say, certain parts, the prisoners of war and so on. But anyway, they had a lot of work.
Simply too much work.
But they also realized that they don't have enough people who are competent in some languages. I remember from a lecture somebody gave some years ago that in Hungary they realized that they just have like 2 officers that can speak Romanian or read Romanian well enough to censor the letters. So basically they just closed the shop. And I don't know what they actually then did, but I mean, you needed dozens or hundreds of them, but you had like 2 or 3.
I think lots of letters didn't made it their way, but I also sometimes I'm surprised when there is a wartime correspondence, and I mean, what some soldiers did is when someone went home for holiday, that they gave them all the letters, that it bypasses censorship. But very often I see them with the stamp of has been censored, but there is really sensible content in there where I am always thinking of I would have censored that.
Maybe they're
So
just
it might,
pretending to censor.
it might be someone who was just overburdened with the work, just stamping. I don't know.
Interesting, yeah. Overpassing the censorship. Do we have any other questions? Otherwise, I think our people who are online do not smell it, but it's a nice smell of coffee and cookies, which is, if you want to have this experience, join us at the Institute. You can't do it through the Zoom, I'm sorry. And if there's no any other question, I will have an honor to close this session, to close this lecture. Thank you, Tamara.
Thank you.
And enjoy your stay, and I'm sure that you will do all the possible archives in Ljubljana. And according to your plan, I admire you. But let's I think you will find everything you need and have a lot of discussion at our institute. So that's why we have the fellowship program. And to all of you that you came in person in such a number, and to all those people who are online, thank you, and see you in another Spitzer when it will be announced. Thank you. Bye.